Sometimes actors found it impossible to separate their on-screen chemistry from their off-screen lives. When passion ignited between co-stars who were already committed to other people, the results could be devastating. These are the stories of 7 stars whose on-set romances destroyed the marriages they'd built before the cameras started rolling. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. In January 1962, Elizabeth Taylor walked onto the set of Cleopatra in Rome to begin filming opposite Richard Burton, who would play Mark Antony to her Egyptian queen. Taylor was 30 years old, at the peak of her beauty and fame, married to her 4th husband, Eddie Fisher. Burton was 36, a talented Welsh actor married to Sybil Williams, with whom he had 2 daughters. Taylor later said she knew from the moment she looked into Burton's green eyes that something was different. On their first day filming together, Burton arrived at 5 in the afternoon after a 2-night bender, hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his coffee cup. He asked Taylor to hold it to his mouth. She did, and they stared at each other while he drank, and she started to giggle. 3 weeks into production, paparazzi photographed them looking cozy on a yacht in Ischia. The affair that followed became a global scandal. The Vatican's weekly newspaper published an open letter charging Taylor with erotic vagrancy for sleeping with Burton while still married to Fisher. Senator Edwin Johnson condemned her on the floor of the United States Senate, and a Georgia congresswoman asked that Taylor and Burton be barred from re-entering the United States on grounds of undesirability. Burton called it Le Scandal. His publicist later recalled Burton's bewildered reaction to the media frenzy, saying the actor had told him he'd had affairs before, but didn't know the woman was so famous that she knocked Khrushchev off the front page. Fisher stopped coming to the Cleopatra set when Taylor and Burton had scenes together because their flirtation was too obvious and humiliating. Burton's wife Sybil initially believed this would be like her husband's other affairs, temporary and meaningless. But she was wrong. Taylor filed for divorce from Fisher in 1963, and Burton divorced Sybil the same year. They married in Montreal on March 15, 1964, just 9 days after Burton's divorce was finalized. They went on to make 11 films together and live a life of extraordinary luxury and equally extraordinary fights. Both were heavy drinkers, and according to studio head Spiros Skouras, in one violent altercation, Burton gave Taylor 2 black eyes and her nose was out of shape, requiring 22 days for her to recover before filming could resume. They divorced in 1974 after 10 years of marriage, remarried in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. Burton died in 1984, and Taylor was buried in 2011 with the final love letter he sent her 3 days before his death. Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford. Rita Hayworth met Glenn Ford when they were cast together in The Lady in Question in 1940. She was 21 and married to businessman Edward Judson, who was 22 years her senior and managed her career with an iron fist. Ford was 24 and recently married to dancer Eleanor Powell. The attraction between Hayworth and Ford was immediate, but both stayed in their marriages while filming. They remained friends over the next several years, their paths crossing at parties and industry events. By 1943, Hayworth had divorced Judson and married Orson Welles. Ford's marriage to Powell was also showing cracks. When Hayworth and Ford were cast together again in Gilda in 1946, the chemistry that audiences saw on screen was real. The film made Hayworth an international sex symbol, particularly for her Put the Blame on Mame performance. During production, Hayworth and Ford began an affair. Ford was still married to Powell, and Hayworth was in the process of divorcing Welles. The affair continued intermittently for years, even after both married other people. Hayworth went on to marry Prince Ali Khan in 1949 and later singer Dick Haymes, while Ford married actress Catherine Hayes. But Hayworth and Ford kept finding their way back to each other. Friends said Ford was the love of Hayworth's life, the one man who saw past her screen image to the shy, insecure woman underneath. They worked together 4 more times over the years. Their last film together was The Money Trap in 1965. Ford later said that Hayworth was the most beautiful woman he'd ever known and that he'd loved her for 40 years. When Hayworth was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in the early 80s, Ford visited her regularly. She died in 1987 at age 68. Ford died in 2006 at age 90, having outlived her by 19 years, but never quite letting go. Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher. This story is actually about how an on-set romance destroyed someone else's marriage. Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher seemed like America's sweethearts when they married in 1955. She was the wholesome star of Singin' in the Rain. He was a popular singer with a string of hit records. They had 2 children together, Carrie and Todd. But Fisher was friends with producer Mike Todd, who was married to Elizabeth Taylor. In March 1958, Todd was killed in a plane crash, leaving Taylor devastated. Fisher and Reynolds rushed to comfort her. What began as consolation turned into an affair. Within months, Fisher had left Reynolds and their 2 young children to be with Taylor. The scandal was enormous because Reynolds represented wholesome American values, while Taylor was already seen as a homewrecker for her previous affair with Fisher while he'd been married to actress Debbie Kerr. In May 1959, Reynolds divorced Fisher, who married Taylor that same month. The public sided overwhelmingly with Reynolds, vilifying both Fisher and Taylor. Taylor received death threats. Fisher's career never recovered from the damage to his reputation. His marriage to Taylor lasted only 5 years. In 1964, while they were filming Cleopatra, Taylor began her affair with Richard Burton and divorced Fisher to marry him. Fisher later married 3 more times, but he died bitter in 2010, his autobiography filled with resentment toward both his ex-wives. Reynolds remained close friends with Taylor in later years. The 2 women reconciled by time and shared grandchildren. Reynolds died in 2016, just 1 day after her daughter Carrie Fisher passed away. Taylor had died in 2011, taking with her the memory of the scandal that had consumed all their lives decades earlier. Tyrone Power and Linda Christian. Tyrone Power was Hollywood's most beautiful leading man in the 1940s, with classical features and an elegance that made him perfect for swashbuckling roles. He married French actress Annabella in 1939, and they seemed happy for the first few years. But by the mid-40s, the marriage was struggling. In 1946, Power was cast in a film and met Linda Christian, a stunning Mexican actress trying to break into Hollywood. Christian, born Blanca Rosa Welter, had already been married briefly and was known for her beauty and ambition. Power was still married to Annabella when he and Christian began their affair. They tried to keep it quiet at first, but Hollywood was a small town, and word spread quickly. Annabella had suspected Power of having affairs before, but this one was different. Christian wasn't content to remain in the shadows. She wanted Power to leave his wife and marry her. The affair became increasingly public through 1947 and 1948. Power filed for divorce from Annabella in December 1948, citing incompatibility. The divorce was finalized in January 1949. Just days later, on January 27, 1949, Power married Christian in Rome in a lavish ceremony attended by European royalty and international press. It was one of the most publicized weddings of the decade. They had 2 daughters together, Romina and Taryn, both of whom would later become actresses. But the marriage that had begun with such passion quickly soured. Power's career was in decline by the early 50s, while Christian's never quite took off despite her beauty and her famous husband. They fought constantly about money, about careers, about everything. Christian reportedly had affairs of her own, including rumored relationships with bullfighters and European nobility. In 1955, Power filed for divorce, citing Christian's excessive spending and constant travel. The divorce was finalized in 1956. Power married actress Debbie Menardos in 1958 and seemed to find happiness, but it was short-lived. On November 15, 1958, while filming a sword-fighting scene in Spain, Power suffered a massive heart attack and died. He was only 44 years old. Christian never remarried. She died in 2011 at age 87, having spent the rest of her life trading on her brief marriage to one of Hollywood's greatest stars. Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra told friends he was going to marry Ava Gardner the moment he saw her photograph in a magazine. When they first met in person at MGM in the mid-40s, Gardner thought he was conceited and arrogant. But their similarities soon became apparent. Both smoked, drank hard liquor, cursed freely, had volatile tempers, and loved violent sports. In 1949, their paths crossed again at a party in Palm Springs. Sinatra was married to his childhood sweetheart, Nancy Sinatra Sr., mother of his 3 children, and had been since 1939. Gardner had already been married twice, first to Mickey Rooney and then to bandleader Artie Shaw, and was known for having numerous affairs. That night in Palm Springs, Gardner and Sinatra left the party together, drunk and reckless. Their first date was so wild they ended up getting arrested, though the studio paid to free them and keep the matter quiet. Gardner reportedly arrived home to find her sister eating breakfast and told her she'd had a wonderful time with Frank Sinatra. The affair became public in 1950 when paparazzi photographed them at dinner. The scandal punished Sinatra more than Gardner. He fell out of favor with conservative fans who criticized him for being unfaithful to his wife, and the negative publicity led to him losing both his recording and film contracts. On Valentine's Day 1950, Sinatra confessed his affair with Gardner to Nancy, who locked him out of the house and hired a lawyer. Nancy initially refused to divorce him, but eventually agreed. In October 1951, the divorce was finalized, and in November, Sinatra and Gardner married in Pennsylvania. By the time they wed, Sinatra's career was in decline, and he was broke. Gardner was the bigger star, and she reportedly helped secure him an audition for From Here to Eternity, the film that would win him an Oscar and revive his career. Their marriage was passionate but volatile. Both were possessive and jealous. Gardner had affairs, and Sinatra rekindled his relationship with Lana Turner to spite her. In 1953, while Gardner was filming Mogambo in Africa, she became pregnant with Sinatra's child. She told him the news, and he was ecstatic, but she secretly flew to London and had an abortion without telling him. When the filming wrapped, she moved to Madrid to pursue an affair with a Spanish bullfighter. In 1954, Gardner filed for divorce. Heartbroken, Sinatra slashed his wrists, but Gardner never came to see him in the hospital. The divorce was finalized in 1957. Despite the bitterness of their ending, they remained connected for life. When Gardner had a stroke in 1986, Sinatra insisted on paying for her medical care in the United States. She died in 1990, and friends said Sinatra was inconsolable. Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. In 1949, Ingrid Bergman was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, known for playing pure, noble characters in films like Casablanca and The Bells of St. Mary's. She was married to neurosurgeon Petter Lindstrom, with whom she had a daughter named Pia. But Bergman had grown tired of Hollywood and wanted to make more serious films. She admired the work of Italian director Roberto Rossellini, particularly his neorealist films Rome, Open City, and Paisa. She wrote to him expressing her admiration and suggesting they make a film together, signing the letter Ti amo, Italian word she knew only from a line she'd spoken in one of her films. Rossellini responded with a synopsis for what would become Stromboli, about a Lithuanian refugee who marries an Italian soldier and moves to a volcanic island. They began filming in March 1949 on the actual island of Stromboli off the coast of Sicily. Bergman was still married to Lindstrom. Rossellini was married to costume designer Marcella de Marcus, with whom he had 2 sons. During production, Bergman and Rossellini fell in love. By August 1949, Bergman was forced to acknowledge publicly that her marriage was ending, and she instructed her lawyer to begin divorce proceedings. In December, gossip columnist Hedda Hopper confronted Bergman about rumors she was pregnant. Bergman denied it, but by December, the Italian newspapers had confirmed the story. On February 2, 1950, Bergman gave birth to a son she named Robertino. The scandal was enormous. Bergman had represented purity and goodness to American audiences, and they felt betrayed. On March 14, 1950, Senator Edwin Johnson took to the Senate floor and called Bergman a powerful influence for evil, an assault upon the institution of marriage. He described her as one of the most despicable women in the world. The Vatican condemned her. She was effectively blacklisted from Hollywood. A week after her son's birth, Bergman divorced Lindstrom through Mexican jurisdiction and married Rossellini by proxy. In 1952, she gave birth to twin daughters, one of whom, Isabella, would become a famous actress. The marriage didn't last. Rossellini was possessive and wouldn't allow Bergman to work for other directors. In 1957, while filming in India, he had an affair with an Indian woman, and the marriage fell apart. They divorced that same year. Bergman wouldn't return to American films until 1956, when she starred in Anastasia and won her second Oscar. Congress issued a formal apology to her in 1972, 22 years after condemning her. She died in 1990, the same day as her 82nd birthday. Carole Lombard and Clark Gable. When Carole Lombard and Clark Gable co-starred in No Man of Her Own in 1932, there was no romance between them. Lombard was married to actor William Powell, and Gable was married to Texas socialite Rhea Langham, his second wife, who was 10 years his senior. On set, they were cordial but indifferent. Gable thought Lombard was a prima donna. She thought he was a ham. At the end of filming, he gave her a pair of oversized ballet shoes to match what he saw as her inflated ego. She gave him a ham with his picture on it to represent his acting abilities. They didn't keep in touch. 4 years passed. By 1936, Lombard had divorced Powell, and Gable had separated from Langham, though she refused to grant him a divorce without a substantial financial settlement. In January 1936, they met again at a party hosted by Countess Dorothy de Frasso. This time, everything was different. They danced together most of the night. Gable suggested they go for a ride in his new convertible. Lombard reminded him she had party obligations, but he promised to bring her back in 10 minutes. She agreed. At some point during the drive, Gable invited her back to his hotel room. She reportedly asked him, "Who do you think you are, Clark Gable?" The comment angered him, and he brought her back to the party, then to her house, where she insulted him about his affair with Loretta Young and the secret child he'd fathered with her. The next morning, regretting her harshness, Lombard sent him 2 doves in a cage with a note that said, "How about it?" They began dating immediately. Their relationship became public at Jean Harlow's funeral in 1937, which outraged their studios since Gable was still married. The press started writing about them. Gable asked Langham for a divorce. She agreed only for a large sum of money, which Gable had to borrow from MGM. The divorce was finalized on March 8, 1939. 3 weeks later, on March 29th, Gable married Lombard in Kingman, Arizona, during his first day off from filming Gone with the Wind. They moved to a ranch in Encino and called each other Ma and Pa. They kept horses and chickens and lived a surprisingly domestic life. Lombard tried to sell eggs from their chickens as the king's eggs. Their only real sorrow was Lombard's inability to have children. She miscarried early in their marriage. There were also rumors that Gable continued having affairs, including with Lana Turner, but Lombard chose to overlook it. When the United States entered World War II, Lombard threw herself into the war effort. In January 1942, she traveled to Indiana on a war bond tour and raised over $2 million. On the return trip, she was impatient to get home. There were rumors she and Gable had fought before she left, possibly about Turner. When seats became available on a flight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, she took them despite warnings from her mother and Gable's publicist, Otto Winkler. On January 16, 1942, the plane crashed into Potosi Mountain shortly after takeoff, killing all 22 people aboard. Gable rushed to the crash site and was found a strand of her blonde hair still attached to her hair clip. At the memorial service, President Roosevelt sent a telegram calling Lombard a great patriot. Gable joined the Army Air Forces shortly after, flying combat missions over Germany, doing what Lombard had asked him to do. He made 27 more films after the war and married twice more, but those who knew him said he never recovered from losing Lombard. When he died on November 16, 1960, he was buried next to her at Forest Lawn Cemetery, as he'd requested.